This is Jacob with J&D Photography, and you are experiencing the Sparking Fire podcast, the podcast about innovative artists and entrepreneurs. Today I have with me my guest, Sarah Shen with Sarah Shen Photo. Sarah, say hi.
Hi, thank you so much for having me today.
You're more than welcome. Thank you for joining us. So Sarah, I kind of wanted to start with a question for you, and that question is what is Sarah Shen Photography?
Yeah, so Sarah Shen Photography is my photography business that focuses primarily on fashion, beauty, and product photography. I mostly work with brands on their social media. So whatever photos I shoot, it's mostly for Instagram content or web content. And then if I had to describe my brand style, I'd say that it's mostly like effortless, cool, and romantic in a way.
Ah, well put, well put. So how did you get started in photography?
So I got started in photography back in high school, actually, so it's about 5 years or so. And I primarily started out with self-portraiture. I started posting those photos on Instagram, and somehow people kind of like followed me and supported me, and just kind of got it started there. And then I moved to LA sometime later for college. So I was there for the past 4 years at USC, University of Southern California. And there I started test shooting with models from all around the LA area, and slowly started to get into it from there. Grew a lot of connections from there. So now I'm finally pursuing my own business. So yeah.
Well, that's wonderful. So what drew you to being a fashion photographer in particular?
I think I've always loved fashion. I love people who can kind of express themselves, and I find that fashion is a really cool and subtle, maybe not subtle, but like a really cool everyday way to kind of tell your own story and show who you are. So that's part of why I really love fashion. So when I'm shooting photos of people, I really like being able to kind of tell a story with the clothing and the environment and try and bring out the person behind it.
So what was your aha moment where you were like, I really want to do this kind of photography, like fashion photography?
I think I've been just doing it for so long that it just made sense. And I've always been super, super interested in fashion. But I think ultimately, so before I've pursued photography, I was in school for business. And ultimately, I finally felt this moment where I was like, I've been assisting for a photographer. I know this industry well enough now. And so finally I felt ready to make the move to be like, okay, this is what I will do and this is what I can do. So that's kind of how I finally made that transition into finally pursuing photography.
Right. And so let's talk about your photographic education. You said you went to school and what?
So I actually didn't go to school for photography. I went to school for business. Actually self-trained for the most part. Learned everything either from organizing my own shoots and producing them myself, or when I was assisting for a photographer, I was learning on set and getting just hands-on experience. So I do not have the professional trained experience that some other photographers out there might.
Yeah. Well, that's actually not too unusual. I'm entirely self-taught myself. I tell everybody that I graduated from YouTube University in terms of my photographic education. So you have a very interesting progression in your career where you went to school for business, but you also had this passion on the side for fashion photography. Talk to me about your progression from being a business student to a fashion photographer, and how you got onto sets and started talking and connecting with other creative professionals.
So for me, I felt like it's mostly been about collaboration. So when I first started out, I was primarily just messaging whoever I could off of Instagram and hoping one day that they would be down to work with me. And eventually it kind of got to be where people would be referring me for photo shoots and stuff like that. And so it just kind of grew to be like this really cool Instagram community that I could be a part of. And I think it's a really, really good resource to be able to kind of connect with other people over time. As for my other assistant position, so I was working as an assistant for another photographer. And so I was a part of my campus's photography club. And so through there, like some people would post job postings and stuff like that. And I somehow got connected to her. So ultimately, I never really, like, I try out a lot of different avenues for getting connections. And ultimately, like, sometimes they'll work out, sometimes they won't. A lot of trial and error. So it's a lot of just like kind of trying to put myself out there in whatever way I possibly can.
Right. So you would say that you put a lot of value on like interpersonal connection and like making connections with people in the industry.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think word of mouth is just so important, especially in like this industry where people care. Like photography is so personal, so it kind of, it's really important to find someone you trust to take the photos, and word of mouth is probably one of the more trustworthy methods of getting referred for something. So that's kind of how it comes in.
Right. So would you consider yourself to be an introverted person or an extroverted person?
I'm definitely an ambivert. So sometimes I'm pretty quiet. Other times I'm just really, really in it and I can really try to put myself out there. So it gets to be a mix, but usually when I'm on set and doing a photo shoot or something like that, I tend to be more extroverted, and I think it's probably because I feel more comfortable in those situations.
Ah, well, the reason that I ask is that, the stereotype for artists is that they're the kind of like introverted loners, and that is, there is some truth to that. So I think a lot of people have problems like, taking their art and turning it into a business because like they have trouble, actually connecting with other people. And like for some people, like, going out and socializing is a very draining experience. So going out to like a photo shoot is something that they almost like, dread in a way. So how would you advise someone who is introverted and wants to get into an artistic field to, how would you advise them to kind of get over their fears of socializing?
I think that like being introverted, you're still definitely able to go and put yourself out there, and you kind of need to be able to still be able to be confident in who you are and kind of be ready to have your work be seen, because that's just part of that. I'd say for me, there were a lot of steps that it took for me to feel finally comfortable with showing my work, and it was just the frequency of doing it, the frequency of reaching out to someone. Like, I remember the first time I ever reached out to a modeling agency, I was so nervous. Worst thing though that anybody can do is just say no. And so I found that really encouraging. Like, people will probably either just be politely declining or ignore the message. So I'd say that like the more that you reach out to people, the more comfortable that you'll eventually get with doing that and being seen. And I think that that's kind of a gradual work in progress. It's kind of just being able to force yourself to push yourself out of your comfort zone. And I think that that's a really good way to grow yourself and your own business.
I agree with that. So, kind of segueing off of that, rejection is rejection is something that people like fear to like a very high degree. But like you were saying, it's kind of part and parcel of doing business. Is like, people are going to say no to you. So like, what would you say to someone who just like, I want to do this, but I'm afraid of the rejection, or I'm afraid of getting shut down?
I'd say rejection, it just happens, and it's definitely a very natural part of having to run your own business and putting yourself out there. And I think that at the end of the day, like, sometimes when it comes to rejection, it's not always about your work. It's not about the the photography. Sometimes it might just also be other factors that have to do with like the situation that they're dealing with. So I'd say that there's so many opportunities out there that you can always keep searching. You just kind of have to keep being persistent with what it is and still kind of push through that feeling of fear of rejection.
Yeah, and like that's a great point because a lot of artists feel very strongly about their work and they feel very like connected with it. So talk to me about like having that separation between like the work that you love and having perspective about like people talking about your work.
I'd say for me, with my work, I'll feel really proud about it when I first shoot it. I'll be really excited about it. And then a couple months later, I'll kind of look back on it and be like, wow, there's so much more growth that I can do to improve from this point on. And then each time I kind of just keep that internally. I feel like sometimes people care a lot about what other people have to say. And I think that at the end of the day, you kind of have to think about how you feel about your own work. And for me, like I like just being able to put out what makes me feel kind of happy. And for me, that is enough for me, actually. I don't always, and like, I'm pretty used to people saying things about my work. Like social media, it's so easy for like any bad comment to just kind of appear and you're like, so it kind of toughens your skin a little bit with social media and stuff. But definitely just being able to push through from there.
Have you ever experienced imposter syndrome before?
Every day. That being said, because like I started going fully freelance maybe May 2019. So it's weird because people will come up to me and they're like, oh, you're a professional photographer? And I'm still sometimes like, am I? Like it's really crazy to me. So I feel like for me, it's really motivating actually to feel like I have a lot more to do and a lot more to learn and grow from. That's what kind of also keeps pushing me further. So
yeah. So let's kind of shift gears a little bit. Let's talk about your business. Like, who would you say is like your ideal client in your business?
So my ideal client is beauty and fashion brands. So I've worked with a couple who I think I finally just started getting into more of like the clients who I actually really love working with, because there's always clients where you're kind of like, yeah, like it's not like fueling my passion, but definitely there was this one client I had recently where one of their notes for brand direction was they wanted things to be imperfect. They wanted things to be kind of organic looking. And I think that that's like something that's really interesting to me, like someone who's willing to put their trust into me and my own vision and be able to try and like collaborate with them on it. So in short, like beauty brands and fashion brands who trust me.
Yeah, that's a good point. So how did you manage to like define that client over your years of experience?
Well, I think that it just kind of because I haven't started getting those clients until this year, and it was mostly just as a result of people kind of trying and finding me. So over time, after I've been working with more and more people and more different personalities, it's kind of gotten to a point where I'm like, yeah, this is actually really nice and I would like more of you guys. So that's kind of how I've reached that ideal client type.
Right. So would you say that, you kind of like fell on this client because like it was like a happy marriage of like what you wanted and what people were coming to you to do?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think ultimately like the work that we ended up producing together, it was something that I could use for my own portfolio. I feel like sometimes there's some clients out there where I won't always want to use for my portfolio, because I feel like it doesn't always speak to me. But I think that like the ideal client is someone who I'd want to keep working with down the line like that, and be able to use for my own work and feel good about.
And that's a really great point because, there's a saying in the photography industry is that you don't show everything that you shoot. Like for me, for example, I'm a wedding photographer, but I shoot some of the craziest stuff ever. Like I got hired to shoot a commercial for a small town in Alabama. And I can't really show that on my wedding portfolio because it doesn't jive with what I'm going for. So in the same way, like you're shooting things for like fashion and beauty, but you're also doing like, things that may not click with that genre. And you're showing the things that you want to show on your website to get the clients that you want.
So I think that like over time, you're always going to have like the clients that don't always fit your aesthetic. And I think that that's okay. Like, I think that the connections that you make during those are very important because it can eventually, like, you never really know where an opportunity is going to lead to. You never know who your client knows. You never know like where something's going to go. And so for me, I will always like work with those clients to the same way that I would work with any of my other clients, especially like even if I'm not as excited about them, because like I ultimately want whatever we create to be fantastic work. As for like the work that I curate for the clients that I want, like I find my portfolio, my social media to be, it's like the first thing that people see when they are looking into me. And so I find it really important that whatever I have there be the kind of work that I want to be hired for. And so like that's because that's like the first moment that you get to catch like that first impression. It's really important that whatever you put there be what you want to do rather than just like your entire body of work.
So on that note, like, especially towards like the beginning of a career, like saying no is like almost like a luxury. So you have to say like yes, 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 yes to things. Like, do you feel that you're at a point now where you can like say no to different projects?
I'd say that it definitely depends for me. Like I think up until this year, I was saying yes to pretty much everything. I'm like up until like 2020, the cusp of it. But I think that this year, like I think I'm really starting to figure out like my business and like the components of it. So now it's like if I feel like a project doesn't meet like the rate that I really want or my minimum rate, then it's kind of hard to say yes to it because it's an investment of my time now, and it's still really hard to say no to projects because it's like what if I miss out on an opportunity? But ultimately, you kind of have to know your worth when it comes to this kind of stuff, and so you shouldn't feel bad about saying no at that point. But yeah, for me, I'm still grappling with this dilemma.
I totally understand that. Especially in my line of work, if a client comes along and they say, well, we only have this much for a budget, and like sometimes money's kind of tight and you need to pay the bills. Like you might cut a deal with somebody, but at the same time, like you can kind of recognize when a client isn't good for you in your business, and so like it may be hard sometimes, but like being able to say no is a good indication that your business is going in the right direction because like you have that level of control to say yes or no to somebody. So what would you say are some challenges that you face that are unique to the fashion industry?
I think that there's just a lot of different personalities, and that it's kind of having to be able to manage all the different types of people that you're going to meet in any given day, which I think is mostly the same kind of challenge that people would be facing in any other industry in photography. Like, because it's so personal, like there's just so many different things that could be happening all at once, and you never really know what's going to go wrong. So it's just like being able to be flexible regardless of whatever is going to come at you.
So what would you say is the craziest shoot you've ever been on?
Ooh, what is the craziest shoot? I think probably the craziest has just been in terms of like how jam-packed a client had wanted things to be, and trying to like hammer every single thing out on like the shot list that they had given us. So it's just like, I think one time there was like 6 models on set, and it was like an 8-hour day, and then we like weren't able to get lunch, and like the client was stressed out, and so it was just really important to stay positive through it and still like kind of try to manage everybody and keep the client happy as best as we could. So yeah, that's about it though. Like there's just a lot of different people that you just have to be able to manage. It's probably the toughest challenge of all.
That's stressful though. I mean, like when you have a client like that, you know, when they're basically paying your bills and they say you got to do this, this, and this, and this, and this, and they demand like absolute perfection, that's kind of a lot. So do you have any like control over like, you know, managing client expectations? Like do you have the opportunity to sit down with the client and say, okay, you wanted to do this and all this other stuff, but I'm going to tell you right now, like with the time frame that you're asking, that might not be possible?
So I think usually when I'm managing client expectations, it's mostly in the planning portion of a shoot. I like to lay out all of my terms in advance of like every single detail I possibly can. So like pricing, whatever number of deliverables they're looking for, and it's also like before a shoot, I also require that a client give me a mood board and a shot list. So mood board so that I know generally what they want and what is possible for me to provide to them. This way, like we can provide feedback to each other and we can kind of work our way through it. And as for a shot list, like that's basically like a list of however many photos or unique photo setups that a client might need. So that's really helpful for me to know, because then I can tell them in those planning stages, like how many photos is possible in the time that we are shooting for, or like how, like, and then also get like a sense of the quality of work that they're wanting. So yeah, basically the most important thing is just being able to talk through everything in the beginning portion before the shoot happens, and then when you're on set, like everything hopefully comes together nicely as a result of like good planning.
Yeah. Have you ever had to talk to a client and be like, yeah, okay, so you have these goals you want to achieve, but we're going to have to restructure everything to make them more manageable?
Thankfully, I have not yet had to deal with that issue, but I can see that as being something that might come up. Usually when people reach out to me, it's kind of like I give them a quote for like the different amounts of times that might happen. So, or the different amounts of times that like a shoot might have to take place over. So I give them the options. And so typically if something doesn't really work out, if something doesn't really fit, then they might just go and move on to another photographer, which it's life sometimes. It's just how it is. So
that's very true. So let's talk about working in Los Angeles as a fashion photographer. So like, you know, typically people associate, you know, New York and Paris and Los Angeles as like the hubs for fashion photography. So what has been your impression of working in Los Angeles as a fashion photographer?
So I think, yeah, LA fashion photography is a bit different than other countries or other cities. In LA, like there are a lot of influencers. There's a lot of smaller individual people who want content for themselves. And I think that that's like kind of a pretty big market out in LA. As for like e-commerce is pretty popular in Los Angeles as well. So that's like one of the bigger buckets and like bigger clients that people can get in fashion photography in Los Angeles. And then there's also some editorial photography, but I feel like the editorial photography in LA sometimes isn't as big, and people don't necessarily make much money off of those as like clients. That's more so for like creative purposes from my experience. But yeah, I'm still kind of up and coming in this area, so that's just based off of what I've done so far.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you mentioned influencers, because like that's been a market that's basically been created in the last like 9 to 10 years. So if you think about it, like Instagram has been around for like maybe a decade or so. And so all these people who are like making money off of Instagram or other social media platforms as influencers, basically they didn't have a job before that. And now they're making like bukus of money by saying, hey, I'm this person with all this influence, give me all this free stuff and money. And that's how they make their living, which is wild. So what are your thoughts on like influencers and like social media?
I think that influencers, they're going to be around for a while. I think that the way that they influence might change a bit more down the line, but right now, like, there's a lot of like stereotypes surrounding influencers, and I think that the ones that will last down the line are going to be the ones that really provide value and like just like true value to whoever their viewers or followers are. There's this one blogger I follow, and she's constantly she's built like an entire empire off of like supporting women who have their own businesses and building like their own like giving them business advice and giving them like mentorship and support. So I think that like once people find their specific niche in how they want to influence people, they'll be able to like really grow from there. But I think that there's just so many smaller and micro influencers out there now that it's really kind of hard to break into unless if you have something very specific that you can offer to people.
So how is Los Angeles different from other like meccas of fashion, like, Paris or New York City?
I think a lot of people kind of look down on Los Angeles for fashion. Like, we don't really have regular fashion weeks. Los Angeles is big for swim, I'd say, swimwear. And like, it is a really popular city for photography because of like all the beaches and stuff, but and the weather is always good for photo shoots. But aside from that, maybe just like lifestyle campaigns and stuff like that. But in terms of fashion, I think people associate it with like the basic LA, California lifestyle fashion. It's not as much like viewed on the same level as New York or Paris fashion.
Wise words. Well, Sarah, thank you so much for joining me. It was a pleasure talking to you again. And guys, you've been watching Sparking Fire with Jacob and J&D Photography, the podcast for innovative artists and entrepreneurs. It was a wonderful show today. Thanks for tuning in, and I will see you next Sunday.